from our break. Welcome to our second session. We trust that you enjoyed Frank Williams. We know you're going to enjoy Craig Symonds. Craig is a graduate of UCLA. He got his master's and his doctorate in history from the University of Florida before going into the officers candidate school into the Navy. He was an ensign, a JG. Then he became a first lieutenant as serving an admiral before he went to the United States Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. From there, he went to Annapolis and became a storied professor at the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis. And he served that body for 20 plus years. He has since retired and he went back up into Newport, and again taught at the War College. Now he's back in Annapolis. He's a very, very prolific author. The one book he'll perhaps talk about a little bit today is Lincoln and His Admirals. This is a prize-winning book, Lincoln Prize, a highly regarded book on Civil War Navy called Lincoln and His Admirals. The one that just came out is War at Sea, which is a prominent book that he completed that is probably 700 and some pages. It might be a book for some of us in retirement to read that are slow readers and want to take our time. But we're thrilled to have Craig with us today. Again, let me introduce to you Craig Symonds, Naval Leadership in Who Wars, David Farragut and Chester Nimitz.
Thank you, Ski. I appreciate that. What a nice introduction. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining us all today, even though it's virtual. And as both the card that was on the screen and Ski mentioned, my job this morning is to talk about naval leadership in both the Civil War and in World War II. And that's, of course, a pretty big topic. And while I thought about how to address this, I wondered exactly what we mean by leadership. As Ski noted, I've spent my life teaching and writing about history, and in particular, naval history. I taught naval history for 30 years at the U.S. Naval Academy. I taught strategy and policy at the Naval War College for 7 years, and somewhere in there too, I taught strategic studies to British naval officers at the Britannia Royal Naval College in England. And in all of that, I wonder, did I teach any leadership? I don't know. I'm not even sure leadership is something that can be taught, but I do believe that studying history and doing so in depth over a lifetime can provide a nearly infinite number of examples of leadership, both good and bad. Frank Williams gave us some pretty good examples from national leaders in his first talk this morning. I'm going to talk more about naval leaders. But, you know, in spite of all that, I doubt that any of my former students, when confronting a situation in, say, Afghanistan, said to themselves, aha, I know what to do here because of what Grant did in the wilderness or what Spruance did at Midway. That's not really how it works. The ancient historian Heraclitus once said rather famously, you never step in the same stream twice. By the time you step in it the second time, it's different water passing by. The pebbles on the stream bed may have shifted. The branches flowing past are different. The weather may be different. The stream may even be frozen. So there are no perfect analogies. Still, having crossed the stream once might well prepare you for the kinds of problems, some of them familiar, some entirely new, that you will confront when trying to cross it a second time. And I think that's probably what Mark Twain meant when he said history does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. Well, I don't want to get too philosophical here, but I do want to emphasize that teaching history or learning about history is a gateway to all sorts of understanding about a wide variety of things, including leadership. And I hope that some of what I taught at the Academy and at the Naval War College contributed to some good decision-making. Many of my former students became admirals, others are congressmen, governors, several secretaries of the Navy. no presidents yet. So yes, I hope that whatever they learned in my classroom made them better leaders, or maybe it's entirely coincidental. So in my effort to discuss leadership, naval leadership in particular, in the Civil War and in World War II, I'm not going to try to identify leadership principles, characteristics, that is a list of things that a good leader should do or avoid. That's what political scientists do or try to do. What I'm going to do this morning is compare one individual naval leader from each war, examine what they did, how they did it, and see if we can find some commonalities and perhaps intuit some conclusions. So who to pick? Well, you already know because it was on the slide and in the title of the talk. So Natalie, can we have that first slide here on the screen? Here they are. I love these two photos, by the way. That's David Glasgow Farragut on the left and Chester W. Nimitz. Note, first of all, their expressions. It's a steely-eyed stare. Note, too, that they both have their arms folded. Maybe that's a measure of greatness. Then, too, what are we to make of the fact, have you noticed this yet? That Farragut has his right arm over his left, while Nimitz has his left arm over his right. What's that about? I checked, no, Nimitz was not left-handed, but good try. We can discuss that later, maybe. For now, let's just talk about the first of these guys chronologically, and that is Farragut. Natalie, the Farragut alone, please. And get the next slide here. Here he is. In many ways, Farragut himself is the personification of America, or at least 19th century America. First of all, he was the son of an immigrant, and so a first-generation American. He was a Western pioneer, born in Tennessee in 1801, at a time when Tennessee was still very much a frontier state. He was a self-made man and a selfless champion of national union. His father, Jorge Farragut, immigrated to America from Minorca. In the United States, he married a Scottish woman. That's where the Glasgow comes from, in the admiral's name. Here's another interesting thing about Farragut. He started his naval career very young. Now, my students at the Academy were generally 18 or 19 when they arrived in Annapolis, though I have had some students who came to Annapolis in their 20s. According to statute, you can be no older than 23 when you report for your plebe year. Mostly that's because some of them serve a number of years in the enlisted ranks first. Others come to Annapolis after completing several years of college. They might have applied after high school, been turned down, went to another college, applied again, went a second year to college, applied again. But there are no transfer students at the Academy. Regardless of the number of credits you bring, everyone starts over as a plebe and does 4 years. I once taught naval history to a plebe who already had a BA in history from Yale. She got a B, by the way. All right, Natalie, thanks. We can take Farragut off the screen here, I think. Most midshipmen today are between 18 and 22. So how old was Farragut when he became a midshipman? He was 9. In the first half of the 19th century, there was no Naval Academy. West Point had been founded in 1802, but Annapolis was not established until 1845. Mainly because by then the complication of steam engineering mandated that officer candidates know a little bit of something about technology as well as leadership before they went to sea. Prior to that, prospective naval officers got their training the old-fashioned way, on the job. Relying primarily on influence and family connections, they applied to their senators or congressmen for a midshipman's warrant, and they went aboard a U.S. Navy warship without any preliminary training at all. Many didn't know port from starboard, or that the pointy end of the ship was called the bow. Captains took them on as proteges, and for years, the young gentlemen, as they were often called, quite literally learned the ropes until they were ready to take a test, both a written test and an oral test, to see if they had learned enough to be promoted to lieutenant. If they passed it, they became what was known as a passed midshipman, who was eligible for a lieutenant's commission when a slot became open. The average age at which young men, boys really, embarked on this career path was 16. So how did Farragut become a midshipman at 9? Well, the story starts, ironically enough, in New Orleans, which of course Farragut would capture as a flag officer nearly 50 years later in April of 1862. Here's the story. Jorge Farragut, by then a widower, worked in the Navy Yard in New Orleans. And one day when he was fishing on the Mississippi, a small canoe drifted past with apparently no one in it. But upon investigation, Jorge found an elderly man lying unconscious in the bottom. He brought the man home, nursed him for several weeks until he finally expired. And as it happened, the man was the 84-year-old father of Navy Captain David Porter, who commanded the American gunboat squadron in New Orleans. And out of gratitude for Farragut's kindness to his father, Captain Porter offered to help out the widowed Farragut by taking one of his 2 sons to sea as a midshipman. Now, that was actually quite a generous offer, because appointments as a midshipman, then as now, were rare and valued. So Jorge gratefully accepted and offered up his 9-year-old son, James. Wait a minute, James? I thought his name was David. Well, there's a story here too. As young Farragut grew to manhood, he decided to honor his benefactor by changing his first name from James to David. That got a little complicated 2 years later in 1813, when Captain Porter's wife gave birth to a son who was also christened David. This, of course, was David Dixon Porter, Farragut's foster brother, who also became an admiral during the Civil War. For the next 40 years, David Farragut, as he was now known, was promoted along with his peers, ahead of many, eventually reaching the rank of captain, the highest rank then available in the United States. In 1860, Lincoln was elected president. The protests about that led to the secession crisis. Captain Farragut at the time was living in Norfolk, Virginia, not only because, again, then as now, Norfolk was a good Navy town, but also because he had married a Norfolk woman. His first wife, Susan, died 20 years before in 1840, and his second wife was not only a Virginian by birth and by residence, she was even named Virginia. So here was a man born in Tennessee, raised in Louisiana, living in Virginia, married to a Southern woman whose family owned slaves. It was a moment that reveals exactly who Farragut was. When he learned in April of that year that Virginia had voted to secede from the Union in the wake of the clash at Fort Sumter and Lincoln's call for volunteers, Farragut announced he would not live in a disloyal state for 1 more hour. He went straight home and told his wife he was leaving. He gave her, in effect, an ultimatum. This act of mine may cause years of separation from your family, he told her. So you must decide quickly whether you will go north with me or remain here. He packed up what he could carry in a valise and left Norfolk for New York City that day. His wife went with him. You might want to compare Farragut's decision here with that of Robert E. Lee. According to Douglas Southall Freeman, when Lee was confronted with choosing between his state and his country, he underwent an agonizing trial. He stayed up all night, pacing back and forth in his study, racked by doubt, unable to decide where his duty lay. Supposedly, his wife recalled hearing the sound of his boots on the floorboards as he paced back and forth over her head for most of the night. In the morning, he came downstairs to tell her of his decision to resign his commission and seek service with the state of Virginia. Freeman's chapter of this episode in his magisterial biography is entitled, "The Decision He Was Born to Make." Farragut's decision was the one he was born to make too. But for him, there was no agonizing, no midnight pacing back and forth. From the moment he heard of Virginia's secession, this son of immigrants knew that he was an American first. The moment Virginia abandoned the federal union, Farragut abandoned the state. Even so, there was some uncertainty in Washington about his loyalty, and for that matter, about his age. He was 62 years old by then. Well, that, of course, is a spring chicken now, as we all know, but considered pretty long in the tooth in 1862. The Union was planning an assault on New Orleans in the spring, and both Gideon Welles, who was Navy Secretary, and the Assistant Secretary, Gustavus Fox, wondered if Farragut was up to the task. So they asked his younger foster brother, David Dixon Porter. Now, Porter's reply is interesting. He started out well enough. This is a letter, so we know exactly what he said. "I see no reason why he should not be competent to do all that is expected of him," David Dixon Porter wrote. Okay, so far so good. But then he added that while his foster brother was likable and personally brave, he has no administrative qualities. He wants stability and loses too much time in talking. At least he didn't claim that Farragut drooled at the mouth. Very likely Porter made these comments because he was angling for the command himself, but he didn't get it. Slow as the mail is today, it was even slower then, and by the time Porter's letter reached Washington, Farragut had already taken New Orleans. Thank you very much. A century later, the historian Charles Dufour would publish a book about the fall of New Orleans with the title, "The Night the War Was Lost." Well, if that's a slight exaggeration, it nevertheless acknowledges the strategic impact of Farragut's accomplishment. In addition to being a bold warrior, Farragut was also a sensitive diplomat. 2 years later, during Lincoln's second presidential campaign in 1864, Farragut was in New York with his flagship Hartford. He attended a Union rally outside the Cooper Union, and according to the New York Herald, when he was introduced from the audience, the crowd rose to its feet and broke into one loud, hearty, prolonged cheer. Resplendent in his Navy uniform, Farragut bowed and smiled, but then when he was called on to make a speech to the crowd, he replied in words that could not have been more welcome to Lincoln if he had written them himself. He said, this is from the New York Herald, "I was invited here this evening not as a politician, but as a naval officer, to see the unanimity and the union feeling which prevails here. I must leave politics to you, my fellow citizens. I meddle not with politics in the way of speeches. I will endeavor to do my duty on the sea while you do yours here." Given the troubles that Lincoln had with ambitious cabinet members and political generals like the ones Frank mentioned this morning, it was no doubt a relief for him to hear that one officer at least stayed above the fray, untempted by the adulation of the crowd or the fruits of political office. Later that year, of course, Farragut did indeed do his duty upon the sea when he charged into the bay at Mobile, Alabama. His flagship Hartford was halfway through the channel into the bay when there was a muffled thump, and the ship immediately to his right, the ironclad Tecumseh, suddenly reared up out of the water, turned over onto its side, and shot downward like an arrow, sunk by a Confederate mine, or as they were called then, a torpedo. When that happened, the ship directly in front of him, the USS Brooklyn, stopped. Then it began to back down. And that, of course, is when Farragut took matters in hand. In order to avoid having his entire column of ships collide into one another like a collapsing accordion, He ordered the Hartford to veer out of line and steam past the Brooklyn to her left, directly through the marked minefield. As he passed the Brooklyn, her captain called across to him to point out that there were torpedoes in the water dead ahead. To which Farragut replied, well, of course, you all know. But here's the thing to remember. This was not an act of unthinking bluster, a kind of forlorn charge like the Light Brigade in the Crimea or Pickett at Gettysburg. It was a practical response to a swiftly unraveling situation. It was also absolutely the right decision. Any other decision would have led to chaos and disaster. Then once through the minefield, without casualties, Farragut's squadron easily defeated the smaller rebel fleet and seized command in Mobile Bay. And along with Sherman's capture of Atlanta, Farragut's capture of Mobile Bay helped secure Lincoln's reelection, perhaps the most strategically decisive event of the entire war. So it's fairly easy for me to hold up Farragut as an example of good leadership for his faithfulness to his mentor, for his instinctive and unblinking loyalty to his country, and for his quick thinking in a crisis. So now, Chester Nimitz. Natalie, can we have Chester on the screen here? There he is. I'm really delighted that Frank, in his talk this morning, used the exact same photo of Nimitz when he was talking about leaders in the Second World War that I'm showing you here. Here's the grim-faced Chester Nimitz. I wanted to talk about Nimitz particularly today because I think he fits the point I'm trying to make about leadership, but also, full disclosure, it's because I'm in the midst of writing a wartime biography of Chester Nimitz, and he is fresh in my mind. He too, coincidentally, was the son of immigrants, German immigrants in his case, who settled in the hill country of North Texas, near where LBJ grew up. The town where he was born, Fredericksburg, was named for the German Prince Frederick. And the town still has a German flavor to it. You can get great German food and lots of German beer in the many German restaurants along Main Street in Fredericksburg. And of course, there is also a wonderful museum there, the National Museum of the Pacific War. When I say that to people, they're often perplexed to discover, wait a minute, why is the National Museum of the Pacific in the hill country of Texas? And the answer, of course, is because that is where Chester Nimitz was born. Like Farragut, Nimitz was raised by a surrogate parent, at least in part. His father died of a heart attack at the age of only 29 before Chester was born. So he was raised by his mother and his maternal grandfather, who taught him, among many other things, not to obsess about things that were beyond his control. Chester Nimitz did not go to sea at 9, like Farragut. The U.S. Naval Academy did exist by then, and young boys did not go to sea as midshipmen, they went to school. In fact, Chester Nimitz had no plans to go to sea at all. A turning point in his life came when he was watching an artillery demonstration at a county fair. It was supervised by a group of young Army officers from West Point in their smart-looking uniforms. Well, Chester Nimitz thought that looked pretty good, but he had never heard of West Point, and he asked them about it. He inquired of his congressman, who told him, I'm sorry, but all the appointments to West Point for next year are filled. What about the Naval Academy? Well, Nimitz had never heard of the Naval Academy either, but it sounded okay. It was free. They wore cool uniforms. And so after passing the admissions test, he went off to Annapolis in 1901 at the age of 17, exactly 100 years after Farragut was born. Nimitz never had to choose between his state and his country as Farragut did, but there is one interesting story about his loyalties I will share here. We can go ahead and take that picture of him off the screen there. We'll come back and look at both of them together here in a few minutes. After Nimitz left for Annapolis, his aunts and uncles back in Texas worried that he would come back contaminated by Yankee influences. So, of course, they were horrified when he came home 5 years later with a young wife in tow, the beautiful 20-year-old Catherine Vance Freeman, who was from, brace yourself, Brooklyn, New York. At least some of Chester's Texas relatives wanted to make sure she knew what was what down here in Texas. So as members of the family sat around together over coffee on this visit, one of them asked Chester what he would do if Texas again seceded from the Union. Would he fight for Texas or for the federal government in Washington? Catherine, in a post-war interview, remembered the woman looking at her pointedly as she asked this question, as if to say, "Now you'll see what's important, little Yankee girl." Chester smiled graciously, one of his characteristics, and answered her quietly, another characteristic, "Why, of course I would fight for the United States against any rebellion." Catherine recalled that the woman nearly dropped her teacup. Now, that's not quite the same as deciding to leave on an hour's notice, and it was only a hypothetical in any case, but Chester made his loyalty clear. A central aspect of Nimitz's life and of his command temperament was his calm and deliberate demeanor. He smiled readily, but it was often a tight-lipped smile that implied a cautious reserve. Maybe we should see that picture again after all, Natalie. I think we see that smile a little bit here. It's a kind of a benign look, but it also says he's got your number, right? The other thing is that he spoke in a low voice, sometimes so quietly people had to lean in to hear him. Visitors found they might have to speak up to make themselves heard. And these characteristics led some to underestimate him. Okay, we can take him off again. We'll come back again later. I just want to keep Natalie busy here. Like Farragut, Nimitz could make bold decisions. That would become evident soon enough. But also like Farragut, he had the patience and the dexterity to maneuver quietly and effectively in an inherently political environment. As one admiring staff officer put it later, he could attain what he really wanted, what he started out to do, without giving the appearance of giving an order. He also had a sense of humor. He didn't tell jokes, a fellow officer explained. He told stories that had a humorous side. This should remind Frank in particular, but maybe all of us, of another leader we heard about this morning, and that, of course, is Abraham Lincoln, who also told stories. Many of these were shaggy dog stories with a lengthy, even an interminable buildup. During social evenings before the war, he sometimes took so long to tell a story that Catherine would interrupt him to say, "Oh, let me tell it, you take too long." You know I'm going to share one here, of course. One of his favorites was about a young doctor who arrived at the home of a nervous father-to-be. "Don't worry at all," the doctor told him. "Leave it to me. Everything will be fine." Then the doctor disappeared into a back room with the expectant mother. After a minute or two, he came out and asked for a butter knife, which the father provided. A few minutes later, he was back to ask for a screwdriver. Then it was a pair of pliers. Then a stiff wire with a hook on the end, like a coat hanger. Now, depending on the audience, this buildup could go on for several minutes, with Nimitz frequently pausing for dramatic effect. Finally, the prospective father, and perhaps Catherine too by now, couldn't stand it any longer. "Doctor," the expectant father said, "is everything all right?" "Oh, yes, everything's fine," the doctor answered. "I just can't get my bag open." Now, some of Nimitz's stories were risque, or at least what was considered risque in the pre-war years. That too was true of Abraham Lincoln. Catherine would sometimes stop him when he began one of these in mixed company, but they were a staple of dinner parties in his quarters in Pearl Harbor during the war. If his guests moved from the dinner table to the card table, which happened frequently, Nimitz might tell the story of the aspiring woman bridge player who was invited to a bridge party at the home of the local champion. Alas, her husband, who was partnered with the hostess, embarrassed everyone by bidding recklessly, trumping his partner's ace, even forgetting what suit they were in. When he excused himself to make a trip to the bathroom, his humiliated wife apologized for him. The hostess graciously waved off the apology, though she did say that this is the first time all evening that I've had the faintest idea of what he was holding in his hand. For all his quiet demeanor and his love of stories, Nimitz also shared Farragut's ability to make bold decisions. Perhaps the most famous of these was his decision to accept the challenge of the Japanese fleet at Midway in June of 1942. Badly outnumbered by the approaching enemy fleet, aware that his strategic mission was to maintain the defensive until after Germany was defeated, he might easily have decided to let the Japanese have the tiny outpost of Midway. Once they occupied it, he could then savage their communications and supply lines. After all, Midway was 4,000 miles from Japan. He knew the Japanese would have a terrible time sustaining themselves there. That was arguably the smart strategic move. Instead, of course, he decided to send everything he had, all the ships, all the planes, out to meet the threat. Like Farragut's decision at Mobile Bay, it was not simple audacity. He was not brash or impetuous. He carefully calculated the circumstances and employed what he called calculated risk. The Japanese had more carriers, but he had the airstrip on Midway Island. The Japanese had more battleships, but thanks to the code breakers, he knew they were coming. On balance, he believed he could win. And of course he did. Here's another example that's much less well known. A year and a half later, in the aftermath of the costly American victory at Tarawa, where 1,000 Marines were killed and 2,000 more wounded in seizing an island less than 1 square mile in size, there was a lot of second guessing about the plan to invade the bigger and stronger island of Kwajalein afterward. All three of Nimitz's subordinate commanders, the fleet commander, Raymond Spruance, the amphibious commander, Richmond Kelly Turner, and the commander of the Marines, who would make the assault, Holland Smith, known as Howling Mad, all decided that attacking Kwajalein was just too ambitious. It would be wiser, they insisted, to focus on 2 other smaller islands nearby and then attack Kwajalein at some future date. Nimitz explained his rationale to them. This is the way he worked. Let me explain it to you. Capturing the 2 outer islands would not break Japanese power in the Marshall Islands, and Kwajalein would eventually have to be taken anyway. On the other hand, if Kwajalein fell, those outer islands would lose their strategic importance. Besides, he believed that he had learned important lessons from the bloodbath on Tarawa that could be applied to the invasion of Kwajalein. His operational commanders were not convinced. Well, Nimitz was always willing to hear advice, so he asked them to state their views. And he went around the room. Every person there proclaimed their preference for an attack on the outer islands. Nimitz waited until everyone had spoken, then waited for another long, pregnant moment before he said, "Well, that's fine. Thank you. We'll hit Kwajalein." That should have ended it, but it didn't. Spruance and Turner continued to argue for striking at the outer islands. The volatile Kelly Turner was especially confrontational, calling Nimitz's plan dangerous and reckless. Even after Nimitz adjourned the meeting, Spruance and Turner stayed behind to argue. And finally, Nimitz said, "All right, this is it. If you don't want to do it, I will find someone else to do so. Do you want to do it or not?" Well, faced with that ultimatum, they backed down. I guess that saying, "that's fine, we'll hit Kwajalein," doesn't really have the same ring to it as "damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead," but it was definitely a damn the torpedoes moment. And like Farragut's, it was a calculated decision. Nimitz was convinced the Japanese did not intend to go all out to defend Kwajalein, and he was equally confident in the adjustments he had made to the landing protocols since Tarawa. Still, he risked a great deal by insisting on going ahead against the unanimous opposition of his staff and his own commanders. If the attack had failed, or even if it succeeded with heavy casualties like Tarawa, Nimitz's tenure as the Pacific Fleet commander might have come to a premature end. As he had done prior to Midway, he carefully considered the risks and then went ahead. The invasion went like clockwork. The Americans lost 300, the Japanese 8,000. And afterward, the Japanese retreated more than 1,200 miles to the west. It was the beginning of the end for them, and they knew it. Raymond Spruance, who spent 2 years as Nimitz's chief of staff before becoming his fleet commander, and who had argued with him so vociferously about Kwajalein, wrote his wife a letter about his boss. Here's what he said. Nimitz, he wrote, was a marvelous combination of tolerance of the opinions of others, judgment after he listened, and determination to carry things through. Tolerance, judgment, determination. Spruance knew what he was talking about. We can see all three of these in both Farragut and Nimitz. And not only let's have both of them together here now on the screen to wrap up. And some of you might begin thinking about questions you would like to ask me about either of these guys. Or about anything else concerning the Second World War or the Civil War in terms of the Navy side of the war. Both of these guys could, and in fact did, tolerate the views of others. Indeed, they went out of their way to solicit other ideas, different ideas, to listen carefully to those ideas and take them seriously. In evaluating those ideas, they calculated all sorts of factors, the plans, to be sure, and the circumstances, who was involved, what were the possible outcomes, even when they had to make a quick decision on the fly, damn the torpedoes. They did not make rash decisions. Having calculated the odds, they applied a quiet judgment. And once the decision was made, they demonstrated a determination to carry through, not to change course in midstream, because, as we know, you never really step in the same stream twice. I look forward to your questions.
Yes, Craig, I have one question. You answered one of them already about your next writing project, but you made a transition from the Civil War Navy into World War II Navy, and I'm just wondering why you made that transition.
I get asked that a lot, Ski. Will not surprise you. I mean, back up a little bit. I taught not just naval Civil War. I taught the Civil War. I was the Civil War professor at the Naval Academy for 30 years. I taught that course every fall to 3 sections of midshipmen. And of course, midshipmen, probably more than most undergraduate audiences, are enthusiastic students of the American Civil War. So I got deeply into it. It guided my research just as it guided my teaching. And I wrote, as some of you know, a number of books about the Civil War, not just navies, Joe Johnston and Pat Claiborne and other things as well. But after 35 or nearly 40 years of doing that, one of the things I discovered, not that it wore me out, that's not the phrase I want, but I guess what I want to say is that I wasn't discovering new things as swiftly as I used to. One of the great things about being an historian is not just that you say what you think, but you keep learning throughout your whole life. There wasn't a single project I was involved in, and very seldom a class that I taught, where I didn't either discover something new or find a new way of thinking about it. And after 40 years in the Civil War, I had fewer and fewer of those moments. And I also taught at the Naval Academy the general course on naval history, which included World War II. And there were lots of things I still wanted to learn about the Second World War. So my transition from the Civil War into the Second World War was guided by my curiosity, my interest, my determination to find out some new things if I could. And I'm still finding out new things.
Well, those of us who are fans of yours are glad you made that transition.
Oh, thanks, Guy. Although I have to say this, that I do get some pushback from some of my Civil War friends. Frank and I and John, who's going to talk later, are all very good friends of Harold Holzer, who still says, "Why did you do that? You should never have left the Civil War." So there are some who are not happy about it.
Thank you.
You've got several questions here. I'll start with the first one we've got from Tom. He asks, how much of the U.S. fleet was lost at Pearl Harbor?
Yeah, Pearl Harbor was a psychological trauma more than it was a strategic disaster. In the decade leading up to 1941, both the United States and Japan, and the world's other navies too, for that matter, all considered the armored battleship to be the true index of naval power. That was why in 1922, when they signed this Naval Arms Limitation Agreement in Washington, the ship that was limited in both size and number was the battleship, because that was the one that was really going to matter. Well, of course, that proved not to be true. Nobody really appreciated it fully until after the war got going, but clearly the aircraft carrier, with its much longer reach, had surpassed the battleship as the true index of naval power. But the Japanese goal in attacking Pearl Harbor was to cripple the American fleet, and by which they meant the battleships, so that they could, without American interference, conquer the resource base of the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, and Borneo, the Philippines, and so on, from which they would draw the vital resources they needed to continue the war. So the idea was to punch the United States in the nose, cripple that fleet, so for 6 months, maybe more, they could run rampant through the Pacific. And they did cripple the battleship fleet. 4 of those ships were sunk, 4 more badly damaged. So the battleship fleet was very much weakened, but none of the American carriers were in Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. That has led conspiracy theorists to say, oh, well, we knew they were coming and we got the carriers out of the way so they wouldn't be here. No, none of that's true. The carriers had been predetermined. 1 was getting a refit in Seattle, and 2 were delivering airplanes to both Wake Island and to Midway to beef up their air forces in case of a Japanese attack. So it was circumstances, not conspiracy, that led them not to be there. But what that meant, and now I'm finally going to answer your question, is that the striking capability of the US Navy was not really much damaged. They lost the battleships, but it turns out that those old and quite frankly slow battleships went about 21 knots and couldn't even keep up with the carriers who steamed at 33 knots. Would not have been a very good platform for striking back at the Japanese anyway. We did use them in the war later on as gun platforms for amphibious assaults because they didn't have to maneuver. Speed didn't matter. It was just the big guns on a big iron boat. But in terms of striking back at the Japanese, all 3 carriers survived, and the Yorktown was soon brought over from the Atlantic, and those 4 carriers were what allowed the United States to keep the Japanese back on their heels during those critical early months of the war.
There's quite a few questions now. The next one is from Connie. How did Nimitz deal with bombastic generals like MacArthur?
Yes, the Nimitz-MacArthur controversy. This is fascinating because Nimitz made it a point never to say anything derogatory, dismissive, or even impolite about Douglas MacArthur. In fact, he kept a photograph of Douglas MacArthur on his desk. And I think it was to remind him, this is my personal opinion, that it was to remind him not to be that guy. Because there were clear differences between the two. For Nimitz, it was all about others, and for MacArthur, it was all about himself. And that became very clear throughout the war, in addition to which they also argued about the most appropriate route to defeat Japan. MacArthur wanted all resources funneled to his theater, which was called the Southwest Pacific, included Australia, New Guinea, the Philippines, and so on, and to come up at Japan from that direction to do what he had promised to do in 1942, and that is to return. Nimitz and his boss, Ernest J. King in Washington, both wanted to take the Central Pacific route. It was more direct. It would allow them to bomb Japan itself, and it would bypass the Philippines. But of course, MacArthur was MacArthur, and he ended up mostly winning that argument. But you're right, it's their oil and water as personalities. They had different strategic outlooks. MacArthur occasionally did make fun of Nimitz. We have a diary from someone on his staff who claimed that every time MacArthur referred to Nimitz, he called him Nimitz, dragging out the first syllable mockingly. But as I said, Nimitz would not say anything negative about him. In fact, one time he was holding a press conference, and a reporter implied that he and MacArthur were rivals in the Pacific War. Not an unfair statement. But Nimitz turned on him and said, if you ever write or print or say anything about that ever again, I will ban you from this theater. So he wanted to make sure there was no whiff of rivalry, of unhappiness between the two of them. So
We have another question from Mr. Staten. He asked, what was the relationship with Halsey after the typhoons and the Leyte Gulf?
yeah, I think Nimitz had a very warm spot for Bill Halsey. He knew Halsey was a bit of a, pardon the pun here, a bull in a china shop, but mainly in the way he talked. I mean, Halsey would say things that didn't help, and we can imagine Nimitz kind of go, sighing and shaking his head. Halsey would say things like, what's your policy in the war? And he said, kill Japs, keep killing Japs. Well, that makes a great quote in the newspaper. It doesn't really help Nimitz in trying to bring the war to a conclusion. The one that really annoyed him was when Halsey would say, I'm going to ride the Emperor's white horse through the streets of Tokyo. No, let's not, maybe don't talk about that. So it was a kind of a tolerant father encouraging a subordinate not to get carried away, because he also admired things about Halsey. He was exactly the guy you wanted when a tough job had to be done. But you ask about the typhoons. For those who don't know, in the wake of the landings in the Philippines, Halsey was off to refuel the fleet. Logistics are critical in the Second World War. He had to bring the oil all the way from California, refuel the ships at sea before they could go back to battle. So Halsey's setting up a refueling rendezvous, and a typhoon came, and he did not handle it well. He went the wrong way. He turned into it. He insisted the fueling continue even when it was clear it was not. We lost several ships. I think 4 destroyers were sunk. Several carriers were badly damaged. We lost more ships to the typhoon than we lost to the Japanese in the Philippine campaign. And it was pretty clear in the investigation that followed that it was because Halsey was always in a big hurry to get things done and hadn't exercised good judgment. He hadn't exercised what Nimitz perhaps would have called calculated risk. So the court found him guilty. But Nimitz intervened. He said, no, this guy brings more to us than he costs us, and we'll stand by him. But it's clear in his private conversations, which I've been able to discover, that he was really disappointed by this. And he was especially disappointed when it happened again off Okinawa, and really considered at that time relieving him, but he didn't. So yes, the typhoons put a genuine strain on what for the most part was a very healthy senior subordinate relationship in the Pacific.
Our next question is, the USS Cairo is on display at Vicksburg. Did any other ironclads survive the war to be displayed later?
No, they really didn't. And that's a sad thing. I was involved with a committee that was going to try to hire, purchase a river barge and build a replica ironclad on top of it. The one at Cairo, if you've read Ed Barz's book about the raising of the Cairo, it's really a tragic comedy because they didn't know what they were doing. They wrapped a cable under it and tried to pull it up. It broke in half and the pieces. So what they've done at Vicksburg is assemble the pieces they were able to raise and then put modern pieces in kind of to hold it together. So you can get a sense of its size and conformation, but that's about all. We don't have any surviving river ironclads to look at, which is really unfortunate.
The next question is, who was the better admiral, Farragut or his half-brother?
I'm going to go with Farragut. David Dixon Porter was an individual who had flaws, and doesn't everyone, but some of those flaws were not dissimilar from the ones that Douglas MacArthur demonstrated. That is to say, he was interested in himself. He was very self-promotional. He took advantage of opportunities to take cotton in the Red River expedition, for example. You heard that he kind of sandbagged his older brother when Gideon Wells asked him, well, do you think your brother's up to this command? So there are just little hints of things that David Dixon Porter did that imply that if you really wanted someone to say, here, hold my wallet for me, you'd probably want to give it to David Farragut rather than David Dixon Porter.
Our next one is from Kay, who asks, tell us more about Farragut's and Nimitz's early careers. How were they chosen for top leadership positions?
Yeah, Farragut, the Navy of the early 19th century it struggled along. I mean, he became a midshipman around 1810. So he was in the Navy during the War of 1812. And actually, there's a good story about that because when you capture merchant ships at sea during a time of war, you would take the crew on board and you'd batten them down below, and you'd put what was called a prize crew on board, very small, just enough to work the ship, an officer and maybe 3 enlisted men. And their job was to take that ship into port. So you'd assign a junior lieutenant or maybe a midshipman to take command of a prize. And sure enough, it became Farragut's turn. So here's a trivia question you can maybe earn money from. Farragut got his first command at sea at the age of 11, when he, as a midshipman and 3 enlisted men, took command of a prize and sailed it into port. So he was the commanding officer of a ship at the age of 11 as a midshipman. But most of the 1820s and the 1830s are kind of a down period for the Navy. They're fighting pirates in the Caribbean. I understand they made a movie about it. But other than that, just kind of hanging around, not much to do. There are distant station patrols. You could be on the Africa station or the Pacific Squadron or the Brazil Squadron, and you spent days kind of sailing around. It's pretty quiet stuff, which is one reason why promotions were so slow. So you could become a lieutenant at the age of 19, which Farragut did, and stay a lieutenant for 30 years. Then war comes, and all of a sudden, wow, everybody gets promoted wildly. Farragut was already a captain. He becomes the first admiral in the history of the United States Navy, the first rear admiral, and then the first admiral. So it's a quiet time for Farragut. For Nimitz, interestingly enough, after his graduation from the Naval Academy, chose submarines. Well, submarines, when he graduated, which is class of 1905, that's risky stuff. That's like being, on a space capsule in 1959. I mean, they're not even sure whether these things will come up again after they go down. So he too had command of a submarine, appropriately named the Plunger, when he was, I think, 21 or 22 years old. So each of them had command experience at a very young age. But like Farragut, Nimitz had to live those decades of quiet time when he was building a submarine base or on the staff of one or another admiral or commanding a destroyer, but pretty quiet until the war came. Just prior to the war, Nimitz had been what was called the bureau chief of the Bureau of Navigation. Now, it sounds like navigation should be about navigating, but it really wasn't. The Bureau of Navigation was the Bureau of Personnel. He was the one who assigned officers to their jobs. So he got to know literally every officer in the Navy during his tenure as head of the Bureau in Washington, D.C. And he also got to know a lot of people in Washington, D.C. One reason why Franklin Roosevelt always called him Chester. So again, for both of these guys, the onset of war, the Civil War in the one case, Pearl Harbor in the other, elevated them swiftly to high command responsibilities. Farragut went from captain to full admiral. Nimitz went from a rear admiral, relatively junior rear admiral, to full admiral, literally in a day, on the last day of 1941.
There's still several questions left. I'm not sure if we're going to be able to get to them all. We only have about 5 minutes, but the next one is from Jerry. Asks, at the beginning of both wars, how well prepared was the U.S. Navy for the impending conflict?
Yeah, it's an American tradition, isn't it? We go into a war underprepared and unready. We build up like fury, and all of a sudden we had this massive industrial complex that produces a cornucopia of weapons. And by the end of the war, we were the most powerful nation on earth. There were 42 ships on active service on the day Fort Sumter was fired on, 42. On the day Appomattox took place, there were 671. Similarly, on the day that the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, the United States had a relatively small fleet. I think we ranked 14th in the world behind Chile. By 1945, on VE Day, we had over 65,000 combatants, and we were a larger Navy than all of the navies of all the other countries on the world combined, ×2. So we went from being underprepared to, I guess what you could say is almost being overprepared. And one of the reasons why that's possible for the United States is our latent industrial powerhouse. In both cases, the United States was able to gin up quickly. Now, there is a difference here, and I do want to make this distinction, and that is that in the Civil War, in the 19th century, when technology was just transitioning from the age of sail to the age of steam, you could take a merchant ship and turn it into a warship, and 480 of the ships out of that 671 were transformed from civilian purpose to military purpose. In World War II, you couldn't do that. You couldn't take a cargo ship or a ferry boat and turn it into a destroyer. They had to be built from scratch. But early on in 1940, the United States had recognized the coming storm. Remember, the war is already underway in Europe, and we could see that. So they passed what was called the Vinson-Trammell Act in 1940, June of 1940, 2 years exactly before Midway, that authorized 18 aircraft carriers, 20 battleships, 100 cruisers, and 200 destroyers. It was a bigger fleet than the entire Imperial Japanese Navy, but it would take 3 years to build it. If we had not done that in 1940, the Japanese strategy of punching us in the nose and then taking over the Pacific, I'm not saying it would have won the war, but it would have had a better chance. Instead, in early 1943, the first fruits of that Two-Ocean Navy Act, as it was sometimes called, began to appear in the Pacific, so that by the end of 1943, when we began the Central Pacific Drive, we had overwhelming superiority.
All right, I think we have time for just one more. And this is interesting because I was just talking with somebody about this the other day, and I don't talk about war history much. Do you know if the Japanese were focused so much on battleships that they neglected to target the oil tanks and dry docks that, if they had been destroyed, would have had a much greater impact on the Pacific War effort?
That is absolutely true. But remember what the Japanese objective was. It isn't to win the war. They never expect they're going to beat the United States in a war. What they think they'll do is knock us aside for a day while they run rampant in the Pacific, gather up all these resources, erect a defensive barrier, and then when the United States is recovered from that attack, defy the United States to come back in. What their thinking was, and this is cultural, their notion was that we can take hardship, the feckless Americans cannot. So what's going to happen is they'll come after us and they'll win some victories and they'll take some islands, but we are going to make them pay in blood for every yard they take. And after a year, maybe two, those Americans are going to say, oh, I didn't know it would be this hard. Can we negotiate? And then there'd be a settlement and an agreement, and they'd get to keep their captures. That's their vision of the war. So given that, the oil tanks, which would have been far more important strategically, all that oil has to come from California, but it would not have done what they wanted to do, and that is knock out the fleet for a 6-month hiatus while they gobbled up their captures. Yeah, in hindsight, Nagumo, who commanded that fleet, should have launched a second attack. He didn't. He had already knocked out most of the American airplanes. He could have done it almost at will. And he should have gone after 2 things, the submarines, which he also ignored, and the oil tanks. And it would have made it much harder for the United States to come back from that. But that wasn't their objective. So that's why they didn't do it.
Craig, the reason that I was discussing that was we had a researcher call in who's writing a new article about Admiral Clarence Williams, who is from Springfield. And he was a 4-star admiral who he was doing some more research on Williams's role in some of the planning that led up to the eventual what worked in defeating Japan during World War II. And there I found an article saying that Nimitz himself had said that the plans that Williams had worked on when he was president of the Naval War College had unfolded just as they would in naval war games. So I thought that was an interesting connection.
You're absolutely right. I'm a veteran of the Naval War College and a great admirer of the work that they do. And one of the famous statements that Nimitz made after the war when he spoke at the Naval War College was to say that everything we encountered in the Pacific, everything with one exception, and that's the kamikazes, everything else we had studied, planned, and war gamed here at the Naval War College. It's a bit of an exaggeration, but it does show that preparing for war, planning for war, preparing contingencies, thinking about those problems, thinking about the history of those problems is useful when you actually confront those problems. So yeah, I'll end with this, and that is that there's an old saying that amateurs talk strategy, but professionals talk logistics. And what Admiral Williams emphasized in that was the critical logistics necessary to sustain a campaign across the entire breadth of the Pacific Ocean with the food, the supplies, the fuel, the ammunition, all the supply train necessary to make that possible is a far more complex problem than simply saying, yeah, let's go get them. And that's what he worked on, and that's why it was so critical.
Well, thank you. There's a few questions that we didn't get to. We're going to hang on to those and keep them open so that we will be able to pass those on to you, and anyone else today that doesn't get to questions, we'll make sure we pass them on to the panelists. So I want to thank you and make sure that we get into our break lunchtime so that people have a chance to get lunch break. And we'll be back so you can stay and listen to the musical stylings of Steve and Lisa Ball from a previous symposium. And we'll have a lunch break from 12:30 to 1. We will see you back after that.
Thank you, Craig. Before you leave for your lunch break, the booklet for this year's symposium is the third in our reading series. This one's called Reading Eisenhower. So if anybody would like one of these booklets, they're free, and they're at the front desk of the Heritage Center. If you'd like to stop by and pick one up. So maybe Craig, you could drive over from Annapolis to pick one up on a weekend or something like that. But if anyone's interested in that, they can just contact me personally, and I will take the time and figure out a way to get it to you. But they are free, and they are at the Heritage Center front desk, so you're more than welcome to have one. But enjoy your break. We'll be back for John Marszalek in the afternoon. Thanks so much.